I would like to acknowledge that we are on the land of the Cree, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Dakota, Nakota, Lakota peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. We respect and honor the treaties that we created on this land and recognize the promises that were broken in relation to this. I would like you to look up at this sign.
This sign reads, "As long as the sun shines, the river flows, and the grass grows." What do you think of when you look at this quote? This quote holds a very symbolic meaning. It relates to the treaties that were signed and the promises that were broken. The creator of the art piece is Dwayne Linklater, a Cree artist, and he named this piece Kakike, which translates to forever in English. This piece is so important because, as we know, promises should never be broken. These treaties were also something that should never have been broken. When Indigenous peoples signed these treaties, they thought they would last forever. They believed that the treaties and promises that came with those treaties would last as long as the sun shines, the river flows, and the grass grows. They thought they would last forever. This art piece is also a quote that many different Indigenous peoples use. In the text, Treaty Elders of Saskatchewan by Harold Cardinal and Walter Hildebrand, there is a quote from Elder Alma that reads, "The government and the government officials, the commissioner, told us that as long as the grass grows and the sun rises from the east and sets in the west and the river flows, these treaties will last." Before settlers had arrived, Indigenous peoples were living on this land. They had their way of life and living. They lived here in harmony with Mother Earth and everything the Creator provided to them. Indigenous peoples had respect for one another and understood how to live in harmony with other tribes. They were practicing Wahkotowan and Wetaskiwin. This way of living all changed when the European settlers came over. For the settlers, the Indigenous peoples, to coexist on the land together, they decided that treaties needed to be implemented. Treaties defined the rights and benefits that each party had. They dealt a lot with land and the usage of the land and resources. The Europeans initially decided this was a good idea because they needed the Indigenous peoples' help to learn how to live off the land. They were not experts, and because of this, they needed to have a good relationships with the Indigenous peoples in the beginning.
Initially, the Indigenous peoples thought that these relationships would be beneficial because of the types of resources that the European settlers would bring. Although these agreements were put into place, there are still disagreements about what promises were made during these treaty signing processes. European settlers have taken over this land and the Indigenous peoples, and they have completely disregarded the treaties that were put into place. In the text, Treaty Elders of Saskatchewan, written by Harold Cardinal and Walter Hildebrand, there is a quote from Elder Jimmy Mayo that states, "They told us that you would not be deterred from living your way of life. Our land, wildlife, the way we live wouldn't be altered and wouldn't be bothered over it." According to many Indigenous peoples, the treaties were made in a sacred way, and because of that, they cannot be easily broken. In the text, Treaty Elders of Saskatchewan, there is a quote from an Assiniboine elder, George Ryder of Carry the Kettle First Nation, that applies to this. He states, "The pipe is holy, and it's a way of life for Indian people. The treaty was made with a pipe, and that is sacred. That is never to be broken, never to be put away." Because of this, the treaty should never have been broken. There are sacred promises that cannot easily be broken, like the European settlers tried to make happen. Indigenous peoples continue to fight today for their treaty rights because these treaties were not broken and should still be held into place. This learning ties into outcome TPP 2.4, develop an understanding of treaties as sacred promises that exist between the British Crown, the government, and First Nations from the curriculum. Students would be able to learn what these treaties were. They would learn that these were promises that were made between the Crown and Indigenous peoples. These promises were sacred to Indigenous peoples, and what made these promises sacred. They would also learn how these treaty promises were broken. This art piece is so important because it is a visual representation of what all Indigenous peoples are fighting for and what everyone should be fighting for. We will be providing our students with containers that have soil in them and also grass seed. We will talk the students through the process of planting their grass seed in the soil. We will tell them that we want them to dig a little hole, put the grass seed into that hole, and cover it back up. Then we will tell the students to refer back to the sign. The sign reads, "As long as the sun shines, the river flows, and the grass grows." They should be reminded of this sign as they look at their grass. As long as their grass grows, the treaties should last.
As we move throughout this space, we continue to acknowledge the Indigenous history on the land in which we stand. The Wascana Park area was an area where many Indigenous people once lived. As we view this art piece, what animal do you think these horns represent?
These bones belong to a bison. Bison were very important animals to the people in this area. The buffalo provided food and clothing for both ceremonial and survival purposes. Indigenous people shared the land with bison and appreciated them for all that they gave. The name of the area, Wascana, comes from the Cree word Wascana ka asasteki, which means bone piles. The art piece name was given to acknowledge how Indigenous people laid the bones down in piles. They would then lay the bones on the ground to draw other buffalo to their ancestors. This action would allow Indigenous peoples to have a continuous source of food and materials and further their Wakotuan relationship. When white settlers came to the area, they named the area Pile of Bones and began to disrespect how Indigenous peoples had been treating their relationship with the bison. The settlers would kill the buffalo for sport, sell it to others, or for their own artificial purposes. This was also done in hopes of getting rid of the Indigenous peoples in the area so that there was more room for the settlers' way of life. They created their own piles of bones. So what is the difference in how Indigenous peoples treated the bison and their bones compared to the way that the settlers treated them? Instead of the bone piles having a meaning of importance, they became a symbol of colonization or control of Indigenous peoples. This art piece, titled Ancestors Rising, created by Mary Longman, represented how Indigenous peoples' history is often buried or silenced. As treaty people, we aim to listen to the stories of Indigenous peoples and to let those stories be heard. How can we make sure that we encourage these stories to be told and that we are not hiding the history of the land? Are the stories that we tell a representation of the whole story, or is some of it hidden, like the rest of the bison horns in the art piece?
The circle of life, or the medicine wheel, points out the interconnectedness of all these ideas. The Office of Treaty Commissioners explains that the medicine wheel is a foundation for the way that we interact and respect others. By using this circle and considering it daily, one can work towards peace within oneself and others. It allows us to be balanced by promoting well-rounded individuals. It is important that we focus on being treaty people in all these aspects, physically, mentally, spiritually, and emotionally. The Saskatchewan curriculum acknowledges the importance of understanding the medicine wheel and using it to describe Maya-Wakatuan and our good relations with others. In Grade 1 Social Studies, students connect with DR 1.2 and describe kinship patterns of the past and present and describe according to the traditional teachings, like the medicine wheel. Students can acknowledge relations in their life and extend the same thinking to relations with treaty. How can we use our knowledge of the medicine wheel to form and strengthen our relations? How can it guide us as we learn about the treaties and their importance?